attention. So they can either spread that out across an enormous complication and barely hang on to the topics, or they can concentrate it in a smaller area to try to acquire some depth. And that's even above and beyond the question of are they thinking at all? Which is in some ways the larger determinant is, are we even bothering? But if we bother, I remember someone telling me that to be a Renaissance man during Leonardo da Vinci's uh, lifetime was a much simpler thing to accomplish than today because of the sheer volume of things there are to know. And as Heraclitus says, hi Geneva, if we want to become wise, one of the steps which is necessary but not sufficient is we have to acquaint ourselves with a great many details. So the number of details rises, the path to get there gets longer and longer, and the amount of time we have to devote to any one topic gets smaller and smaller. So there are problems with a hyper complicated, hyper busy world when it comes to trying to achieve wisdom. So let's see. I see that Sharon has joined us and Ginny has joined us, and we have some folks we don't normally get to see. Hi, Joshua.
Hey, yeah, I
Welcome.
just talked to Kenneth last night, and he said this was happening. So I messaged David, and I didn't realize that this was an ongoing thing. So, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to ongo it, but maybe and hopefully. But
Yeah.
just talking about what you were just bringing up, I think, on the one hand, that is true. I think on the other hand, though, part of your responsibility, if you're striving for wisdom, is, after a certain time, starting to see, yes, is there an overwhelming deluge of detail? Yes, there is. But on the other hand, as you acquaint yourself with, the Heraclitean idea that you just brought up, with much dirt, right? You also need to start being able to kind of dismiss a lot of details, because you hopefully will start to recognize patterns that indicate that, okay, I don't actually need, like, if you think of music as an example, right? Like, I don't need, after I've become acquainted with a certain level of pop music, I don't need to hear every new song that comes out, because there's kind of these reiterative patterns that I start to recognize. Yeah, that's not gonna be of interest,
Right.
or value 2 years from now, or 10 years from now, or whatever. So I don't need to pay attention to that. And I think that is where, Nietzsche's concept of, where Nietzsche said, I think this is at the beginning of tragedy. I can't remember the one about tragedy, where he says, science, basically he's talking about the difference between science and wisdom. He says science wants to know everything at all costs. It wants to know everything, but wisdom wants to know what's worth knowing.
Right.
And so obviously you have to acquaint yourself with a large amount of detritus, in a way, to gain that. But if your goal is wisdom, then over time, that acquaintance, I think you can start to be able to see past the kind of distractions and delusions as well.
Yeah. Yeah. That it's something Kenneth talks about a lot, the need for that kind of developing that sense of taste for which are the things that
Yeah,
matter the most and which are the things that matter less, to be able to sort the foreground from the background. Yeah, I'm
yeah,
with you. Um,
yeah. So that you end up not, you don't have to actually taste everything. That
right.
you because you can start to recognize there's patterns of flavor, right? And I've, okay, I can tell by the pattern I'm seeing that this is something I've tasted before. I can put it for now. And but obviously there's the danger in that as well. You don't want to, you have to guard against becoming kind of like so concentrated and focused that you then revert back into what we're arguing you shouldn't be, which is this kind of myopic totally concentrated, focal
Right.
view that only sees what's directly in front of it and ignores, the ceteris paribus, right? The
Okay.
all things being equal. We can't fall into the trap of being like, well, that's just this. But I think you can say, well, at the moment, I don't find this to be worth. I don't find this to be of value for the. Well, I guess actually that also cuts back to you have to, it's like you have to have wisdom to be wise. Like
Right.
you have
How do
to
you know
you
which
have to
should
be
be
looking
focusing
for
on?
the value to know if to know what is of value.
Yeah. 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 There's no mechanical script for this, right? It's so
Yeah.
so mostly this is the sort of the intro part of this discussion. It's what we want to kick off for our regulars. This is week 100 of the Millennia and Microcosm series of Kenneth Smith philosophy seminars on Zoom that we've been doing, that David Royal's been organizing. And we've had some regulars who've been here most of the time, and we've got some new folks, and we have some old folks who haven't been on these calls before, but who know this material well. And part of what's exciting for us for week 100 is that we have Kenneth Smith joining us today. And I don't know which of his three connections. I see Angela's iPhone and two others that are on mute. I don't know which of these he's going to be able to get the audio on, but he wanted to participate to help celebrate our 100 weeks of Kenneth Smith Millennium Microcosm. So
And
Kenneth,
Kieran Townsend is coming in from Europe somewhere.
not yet. Sharon is here in Seattle. She'll be getting on a plane. I visited her with yesterday. We spent all day together.
Oh, kidding. Oh, that's great.
That's great. My first time getting to meet her face to face.
Oh my goodness gracious.
She'll be getting on a plane to Japan tomorrow morning, and she's going to go around the world. This is
I
one of
know, ooh la la, you know.
herself. So, but she's able to join us. She's arranged to have her cell phone or iPad from her hotel room to join us. So if Kenneth, if Kenneth, I don't know if you can hear us, but if you can, when you get to the part where you're able to come off mute and speak, just let us know, and we'll 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 be very interested in what you have to say. Until such a time as the technical issues are worked out, we'll just continue our discussion. And part of what we're doing is backing up and doing a retrospective. So the reminder for anybody who's watching the video on YouTube or just joining us, we've been doing Kenneth Smith philosophy seminars for 3.5, 4 years, something like that. And something like a year and a half to 2 years has been on this, I guess it's 2 years now, has been the series on Millennia and Microcosm. And this is the book that David and I are working on putting together to get published based on the column End Times that appeared in the Comics Journal back in the 1998, 99, 2000 timeframe. And the focus of this session, not of the session, but of the series, is the idea that our worldview is not just a lens through which we see the world, but it's also a trap that prevents us from seeing the world as it actually is. And like the problem of fish being unable to discover water because they're swimming in it all the time, we're unable to see the blind spots that our worldview imposes on us because we think with it all the time. We take it for granted. Like as Hegel says, what's familiar is for that very reason not recognized for what it truly is. We're too familiar with seeing the world in a modern way, and so we take it for granted. So the project that's the philosophical project proposed in this book is that we learn to see the world at least 3 different ways through 3 different worldviews, so that with that practice, we can turn them on each other and start to see what the blind spots are that one worldview has, but that maybe the other 2 worldviews might not have, so that they can expose each other's kind of lacunae and give us a greater ability to understand the distorting influence that our worldview is having upon us. So most of these last 100 sessions and the next month or so are focused on chapter 4 of this book. It's a lot of time to spend on one chapter and the ramp up into it, but it's because this is the ancient worldview. This is trying to get us not to understand the Greeks as some sort of modern caricature of who they were, not who we think they were, not how we think we saw the world, but trying to shed all that and say, how did they actually see the world in ways that are fundamentally different from the way that we see the world? Kenneth wrote this thing with a series of lettered sections, and each of these lettered sections gets one or two core ideas of that worldview that are alien to the modern worldview. There's a link. I will pop it again in the chat. David has scanned all of the columns and put them online, so you can go there and see chapter 4 online and click to see the others if you're interested. But there are basically, what is that, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lettered sections. And I'm just going to reiterate them because we're going to be talking generally today about the Greek worldview. So I want to remind us what the kind of core dialectics and principles are that we've gone through about the ancient worldview. Section A is nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth. And this is talking about the way that the Greeks saw nature itself, the processes of change, and the authority for what's true and what's not true as all intimately related in a dialectical system that's very different from the way moderns make decisions. So, for example, voting has nothing to do with what's true. Getting a crowd to agree with you has nothing to do with what's true from the ancient worldview. Being able to cite an authority in a book has nothing to do. All the things that, like Wikipedia, all the ways Wikipedia decides what to include and what to exclude are strictly modern and would have no place in the ancient worldview, as an example. And the ways in which we are prone as moderns to being persuaded by propaganda, advertising, logic, what does the law tell us? All these sort of systematic, organized intellectual ways of deciding what's true or false, these were alien to the Greeks. They didn't think that held any authority. That nature itself, kata phusei, is the ultimate authority. Section B was on custom and nature, aristocracy and philosophy. And this is talking about, what are the natures of things? What are their, what is their ethos, their character, the essence that makes them what they are, and how does that, play out in what they're able to do and not able to do. In section C, form and matter, organicism and arete, we were talking about the difference between what we might want to impose as the pattern on something and what will it tolerate. What is the intrinsic character of the matter that we're trying to shape, and to what extent does that limit our ability to exert our wills upon a piece of wood, a piece of stone, a piece of, a chunk of clay, or even on the world itself. And the ways in which, to the Greeks, that was a very natural way of thinking about the world. But to us, as the heirs of the kind of medieval God of Genesis, the idea of, we'll just exert our will perfectly and change everything to be exactly the way we want it to be, has led to a sort of counter-natural concept that we can make the world be anything we want it to be, that the world is ours to play with, and that we don't have to fit ourselves into it or harmonize ourselves. There's sort of a celebration of refusal to accommodate the world that's taken for granted among moderns, that's very alien to the ancients. They didn't see the world that way. Section D, arete or natural excellence, we really got into the Aristotelian idea of what a species is characterized by its gifts in full bloom. We use the example of the cheetah and its ability to run like the wind, and that's what a cheetah is. And it's not to say that there aren't baby cheetahs who can't do that yet, or old cheetahs who can't do it anymore, sick cheetahs or deformed cheetahs that can't pull it off. But to understand the thing, you have to understand its gifts, its arete. And when we look at Homo sapiens from that perspective of what are our gifts and what's our arete, we end up with very different answers from the ancient worldview than we do from the modern worldview. And that's explored in there. Section E, daimon and eudaimonia, is really, among other things, exploring Heraclitus's concept character as fate, ethos, anthropoi, daimon. To what extent do we have free will? To what extent is our behavior predetermined? And of course, in the dialectical mode that the ancients took for granted, there is this equivocation between the two, where it's neither all one nor all the other. It has to do with whether you know what your character is and whether you take on the responsibility for cultivating your character. Because if you do, then you can alter your fate over time by cultivating your character. But if you don't, if you just passively act out whatever your character currently is, then you end up being more of a symptom of your character than an actual individual, who has any kind of meaningful freedom. Section F, mythos and logos. That was a long discussion, wasn't it? We're talking about, the different ways of looking at the world, the different kinds of cultures that the Greeks went through from their earlier, more mythic stage of culture to their later, more logos stage of culture that was associated with their downfall and collapse. And how moderns look back on the Greeks and we praise them for the logos stage of their culture without recognizing how that stage of their culture was in fact associated with their collapse and catastrophe. We don't see the problem because we look in the mirror, we see ourselves, and we have good feelings towards them because they look like us and we like ourselves. Moderns are very self-praising. That's why we call ourselves moderns. We're the best. Everybody else is archaic, right? This is core to the modern worldview. But mythos culture is a richer way of grappling with truth and human nature. It recognizes the bounty of the unconscious, pre-conscious part of our decision making, how much is taken for granted. It recognizes that different character types, although we might want them to be persuaded by logical argument, may not be at all. And if we try to effect a good society strictly on a rational basis, we're doomed to fail. We need a more complex relationship than that. It has to be both rational and emotive. We need that mythologizing function to happen in society to help to make the deepest truths and the most essential principles and directions for society be accessible to everybody, from the least sophisticated mind to the most sophisticated mind. If we don't do that, then we end up with society flying apart at the seams. So to the Greeks, this was a duty of the Aristoi. It's what the Aristoi were for, was to be mythographers, to really grasp the deeper principles of life, which are hard to come by, and then to wrestle with that, to figure out the politics of, where are we supposed to go from here? How do we explored anthropoculture as part of this, the duty to cultivate a healthy form of Homo sapiens, because there's so many ways to go wrong with Homo sapiens, more ways for us to go wrong than there is for a cheetah to go wrong. And we talked about why that was and how that comes about. In section G, character and class, which is the most difficult for a modern to accept, we talked about how if you put all these things together, one of the implications is people are not equal. We are not all the same. It's patently obvious, but we're not ideologically prepared to accept this as an idea. We're ideologically prepared to insist that everybody's equal. And so, why shouldn't Jeffrey Dahmer be hailed as just as good as Martin Luther King Jr.? Because we have this antagonism to the idea of making judgments and saying some people are better than others. And yet in our everyday life, if we're going to get brain surgery, we'd really rather it be done by a great brain surgeon and not by a guy on a street corner shouting about, how he's sure he could be just as good as anybody else. So we have this kind of, we have this kind of schizophrenic reaction to issues of judgment and hierarchy. But the ancients didn't. They just accepted right off the bat that different people are good at different things. The discussion of arete that came earlier makes that clear. If I'm going to go under anesthesia, I'd much rather have Sharon do it than me do it. She knows what she's doing and I don't. And that if you take all of this seriously, it implies that the proper form of society for Homo sapiens is one in which we recognize the differences in capabilities and judgment between people, and we structure society accordingly. And yet, if we look at the US Constitution, we see anybody can be president. Regardless, it could be their most fervent desire to destroy the world because they believe that if we all die, we'll all go to heaven. The Constitution says that's fine. Sure, destroy the world. Why not? We have literally no value level judgment about even who should have their finger on the button. This is kind of core to what it means to be modern. And so for us, grappling with or trying to read Aristotle or Plato or Heraclitus, it can be either grating or we can completely misunderstand the text in front of us because of our insistence of imposing the modernist interpretation upon the text that we're reading. So this is what we've gone through so far. We've gone through A through G. We haven't yet started sophism and corruption, which is going to be about the loss of nerve and the downfall of the ancient Greek civilization. But that's going to come next. So right here on the cusp, having talked about the features of the ancient worldview that allowed them to create their golden age, if you will. We happen to have Kenneth this week, who hopefully, if he can come off mute, can join us and give his critiques. But while we're waiting for that,
Star 6.
Say that again.
Star 6.
Yeah. So Kenneth could press star 6, and that should bring him off of mute, and then he should be able to participate. So. But when he jumps in, before he jumps in, why don't we just start with initial comments about kind of what people are thinking about these topics, whether they were in it or not. I mean, Joshua has been exposed to all of this stuff before for many, many years. So he's the rest of us are sort of trying to catch up a little bit with where he's at on this. So Phil, you've got your hand up. Why don't you come off mute and tell us what's on your mind?
Yeah, look, I've enjoyed participating in this meetup, but as you explained, the thing is to learn these 3 different aspects of the culture to, in a sense, contrast and show, to make more visible our own culture where we're missing. But I wonder whether that view is correct in this sense. I mean, despite the fact that we are exploring 3 different manifestations of Western culture, it's primarily Western. It almost seems like a history of Western thinking. Where is the Eastern? Where is the Aboriginals? Where is African? Where is the Oceanics? Where is the American Indians? It just seems perhaps we are learning all the dimensions of swimming in the water, and we've begun to recognize the water, but we never crawl into the land to see how different it is in the land. Or we haven't flown in the sky to see how different it is in the skies. So does that restriction does not, in a sense, throw a kind of monkey wrench into the project, because we are still just seeing ourselves, in a sense, because it's all Western. We see it through time, so there's a teleology, and Hegel has done that in a way, So, so that's why I mean it seems more like the history of the teleology of Western civilization, and so I wonder if that shortcoming doesn't contradict what you're saying, that we could then be able to see ourselves in our era in a more clear-headed fashion. So that's a question I want to ask. I mean, it is a ambitious project, but it seems to be it's kind of like studying the human body. You just cut off the leg and the arm and so forth. I said, there you are. You got a very, very good head. It makes me feel, and I to a certain degree, I feel this way, and I think whether brainwashed because of this, is I do feel that these other cultures are more, quote, I'll put in air quotes, primitive. and maybe that's not the way we should think about it, because they see things in a different way. So I'll just leave that as a question. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. So there's a couple of things about that. One is that, of course, you're right to identify the sense that everybody else is more primitive, as that's modernism speaking. That's our own worldview, imposing the idea that because we're the moderns, everybody else must be some primitive version of us, either primitive or defective, and sometimes both. And so, of course, part of what we've been exploring in these past 100 sessions is the idea that the ancient Greek worldview is not a primitive version of the modern worldview. It's a completely different worldview. And it's given, despite the fact that the medieval worldview developed out of it, and then the modern worldview developed out of that, it doesn't therefore follow that this is the same kind of development as evolution, nor that it's the same kind of development as embryogenesis. The ancient Greeks were their own worldview. They had their own worldview that has its own strengths and weaknesses relative. So I'm with you on that completely. Certainly the same would be true, of ancient Chinese worldview, of, worldviews from the, Tamil Renaissance in southern India and so forth. And Kenneth doesn't by any means intend to suggest that only the European worldviews that are under discussion here are the ones worthy of knowing. Rather, it's a couple of things. One is that these three worldviews are very well documented. We talked before about the idea that part of why we focus on the ancient Greeks is not because we want to be ancient Greeks, but because the ancient Greeks were so obsessive about writing everything down, and that they started so early that they managed to capture part of the mythic stage of their culture. And therefore, the transition from mythos to logos, which is documented hardly anywhere else in the entire body of human literature. It's rare for somebody to be writing that early and capturing that change in worldviews. But partially it's because this is our own ancestry. The modern worldview has come to dominate the whole planet, and it erupted out of Europe. It's a Eurocentric viewpoint. So even the least Eurocentric person in the world today, other than there's an island I know in the Indian Ocean that has no contact with the outside, but I don't think there's anybody else. I think that's pretty much it. Everybody else is captured by the global economy and modernized, and so our ways of seeing the world are significantly affected by that. And by going back to the ancient and medieval worldviews, it's directly relevant to how we got where we are. How did this worldview explode everywhere and come to take over everything? Knowing what it grew out of, is critical to anatomizing it. But the final reason, the final thing that's relevant to this, I think that's important, is that Kenneth's by no means saying that we should limit ourselves to three worldviews any more than we should limit ourselves to one worldview. The whole point of the book is the exercise of learning not to be a slave to a worldview. And that once we've gone twice through the exercise of learning to extricate ourselves from this labyrinth that we think within and with, it will be in a better position to then try to take on other worldviews, to learn about them, and try to sort of add to our repertory of perspectives.
I will agree with you that in a sense, the Western civilization in general has finally reached a magnitude that is globalized. But because even the Chinese or even the Romans, in a way, it wasn't globalized. But I don't agree with you about the history. I mean, sure, the Greeks have written it all down, and continued by the Romans and so forth. But the Chinese have been writing probably longer than the Western civilization. So has the Indians, And so the fact that the Western civilization has, in a sense, a theology of historicity makes it kind of different, but so does the Chinese. And so does the Indians, although it's much more complex, it's much more diverse. So, yeah, you might not be able to say that about some other culture that has this long historicity running a long line. And so therefore they have a better concept of time. We have a better concept of time maybe, but I'm not sure if that's true, universally in that sense. So
yeah, by all means, those would make outstanding books to add. To somebody should write those books as well about the ancient world, worldviews and medieval worldviews of China, about the ancient and medieval worldviews of India, and maybe their courses of development are different, and it doesn't correspond to the ancient, medieval, modern, and we're going to see something orthogonal. But somebody who's an expert at those things, needs to who can grapple with these topics needs to write those things and sort of add them to this kind of growing collection of ways to jar ourselves loose from the strictly modern one. I'm going to call on Stephen in a moment, but first I'm going to call on Joshua because, yay, Joshua, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I mean, I think that Phil is obviously bringing up a valid point. I would argue part of it is what you were saying towards the end there. I'm not so sure that it has so much to do with the historicity, so much as we're talking about kind of what we were talking about with digging through all of the details earlier. You know, that we're as individuals, we don't necessarily have the capacity to understand everything. And I think in Kenneth's case, with specifically the issues we're talking about now, we're going back to a kind of what seems to clearly be an extremely potent worldview in the Greeks and the ways that it's influenced the world since. But I also think that having read and discussed with Kenneth much of his thinking and writing, I think that you'll see throughout there is both explicitly and implicitly, but probably more implicitly, there is the issues of Eastern perspectives and also Native American perspectives are rife throughout. And there is very regularly correlations being drawn between these worldviews and the ways that they relate, the ways that they disrelate from each other. But I think in the case of this particular series of essays that we're discussing, it is more just this is what I have kind of devoted a life of study to. All these other issues that I see relating to, I'm going to bring in, but I can't necessarily speak to. I'm speaking for Kenneth at this point, but I think I'm pretty confident saying that it's not that he considers it any less valid, but that he doesn't have the level of scholarship with ancient Chinese thought as he does with ancient Greek thought, even though there, like I say, I think there are correlative issues throughout. And I mean, he and I in discussions are regularly discussing how Taoism, how the Taoist concepts of yin and yang relate to Greek concepts of form and matter, and how they're similar in very many ways, but also different in many ways. And yeah, I think those issues are very much involved and implied. They're just not as explicit. But Phil, you also made me think of a book that I think might be worth reading if you guys don't know it. It's called The Great Transformation by Karen Armstrong. And she in that book, she is dealing with that kind of 500-year ferment that took place that does seem to have been a kind of revolution of mind throughout the world around the time of like the late classical or maybe early classical Greeks to Christianity, where Zoroastrianism and Hindu and all these other different religions, Buddhism and Taoism, are all kind of like happening all over the world at the same time. And she's trying to correlate them. And so that might be something worth reading for you specifically, but just because you brought this issue up.
Thank you, Joshua. Yeah, it's certainly we've talked very early on about the importance of the other major traditions of worldviews. We spent some time on Taoism. We spent some time on Confucianism and Moism, and not nearly as much as they deserve by any means. But that's again a factor of not knowing, not having the depth of scholarship, like Joshua says. And the problem is that most of the worldviews that have existed on the planet were never documented. We've been around for what, 200,000, 400,000 years as a species. Most of that was never written down. And even when it has been written down, as we're going to see when we get into the medieval section, kind of some of the great will to genocide that dominated Europe for 1,000 years meant that when we encountered other peoples, we had a tendency to erase their literature. It's like, how many Mayan codexes were burned by Spanish missionaries during the Conquista, and it's horrific. So there are things that we could have known about other worldviews that we aren't going to. This issue is also explored in Umberto Eco's book, The Name of the Rose, which is a medieval mystery that all centers on the idea that Aristotle's Commedia gets deleted by Christian monks who don't approve of what's in it. I'm going to call on you in a moment, Joshua, but I'm going to do Stephen first because he's had his hand up longer, and then I'll call on you. So Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just going to say, looking at this material, for me, there's a struggle, and that is that question of God, man, and nature. We use the word nature. We use the word man or human or humanism. And then we have God or theism or supernature or gods, if you like the pagan gods who are more fun. Now, how did, say, a group like the Greeks view nature compared to us, man compared to us, supernature compared to us? Some people are saying there is no such thing as supernature. Okay, that's part of the modern worldview. And of course, in the age of the Greeks, we have a transition. The Jaspers calls it the axial age. The axial age, and this is even before Greece, it was happening in the Levant. Before the Greeks actually started, the Greeks took what was happening in the Levant, were very impressed by it, and took it further. And that was the use of new concepts, like, for example, money. Money virtually becomes a new concept in the world of trade. It changes the way people act and think. So in this age, we're not just saying the Greeks, as we call them, are undergoing a transition in worldviews. As you said in earlier meetings, the later Greeks, the time of the Epicureans, they're looking back at the early Greeks thinking, when you got stuff like the Bacchanalian cults, what drugs were these guys on? How did they flip out? Now, if we have our big meeting, the Emperor, Constantine, Big Brother, as we know him better, calls the big meeting. Oh, well, I want you guys to sort out what nature is and what man is, and if it is there, the Holy Spirit, supernature. And I think we should have this sorted out by 5 o'clock with afternoon tea. And immediately, of course, the whole parties start having a punch-up over what these things are, just as they had a punch-up over what Christianity is. And so, yeah, that's my question. What do we see nature is? For example, this is a big word. According to nature, nature has a big popular term now. Hippiedom loves it, but do we really understand nature? Or nature is just something I've read in the book with nice pictures. Ah, yes, that's nature. Or what is nature if I really start facing it and its message, which is not always a friendly message, starts coming into me. So yeah, that's a question I've got. God, man, and nature. How do we view these things? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I can see that Kenneth is having some trouble getting the audio to work, and I'm hoping that David can work with him offline to get that operational. I don't know why the audio is not coming through. I can see he's off mute, but I'm none of us are hearing him as far as I can tell. So it may be that that'll have to be a future call, unless David and Kenneth can get it sorted out for today. Yeah, those three sources of meaning. Kenneth has talked about that before. You know, one shorthand way to think about the differences between these epochs is that the ancient worldview sees nature as the top source of meaning and interpretation, and God is below that. The sacred is below that. It's an expression of nature. The Olympian gods are supposed to respect aspects of nature, and that man falls below both of those things. And then the medieval revolution is to overthrow nature by having the God of Genesis be in no way constrained by nature. When he creates absolutely with his will, and makes things however he wants them to be. And as a result, nature has no meaning at all. It's just a consequence of the whims of God, and it then becomes about God and man as the core of meaning. You know, can man through the gift of grace find his way into compliance with God's will and his plan? And then the modern revolution is to overthrow God as a result of the corruption of the medieval church. And the result that we get then is, well, without God as a source of meaning and without nature as a source of meaning, we're falling back on man alone as a source of meaning. And
We
saying,
only have to throw him under the bus now, and we'll be
I
right.
know what's the next stage? Who's left to throw under the bus? But Nietzsche's critique, right, is that man is a problem, not a solution, not a source of answers. That all of the different techniques we've tried to use to turn man into a source of meaning reveal an underlying nihilism. Man's too variable. You know, man can be a cannibal, or man can be a saint, or anything in between. And with that level of variability, you don't have a frame of reference. And as a result, many things that on the surface in modernity seem to be meaningful and coordinated, when you scratch the surface, it turns out it's might makes right. Just sort of wearing a friendly mask with a smile on it.
Yeah,
So
I'm going to say this view that somehow nature was the top tier.
yes,
I could be wrong, but I just get the feeling that something here is still a modernist view, that we aren't understanding nature really from the perspective of ancient times, or even the medieval. Even the medieval, which had thrown nature under the bus, still, I think, had a better feeling for it. I'm just wondering what you think about that.
well, certainly that would be Aquinas's line, right? That nature is reveals the fingerprints of God, and we can learn about God by studying His creation, and that it can be used as a way to help triangulate on God's will. So in the medieval epoch, you see a range of options as to whether nature is the realm of sin to be resisted and ignored and suppressed, or whether nature is the signature of God to be studied and cherished, and so on. And the reason they could be variable about this is because of the central focus on avoiding polytheism. I'm trying to be monotheistic. I'm trying to say there's no magic, there's no meaning, there's no anything but God. It left them in an equivocal position about the relationship to nature. But at least it was equivocal. Whereas the modern perspective is, nature is our toolkit and our larder, and it has no meaning at all. It's there for us to use.
Oh, okay. Is nature home or alien?
Right. This is the question that helps to distinguish these three different epochs. Yeah, you're putting your finger right on it, Stephen. Thank you. Joshua, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I was going to respond about the varying perspectives, but I think what Stephen brought up is actually maybe more interesting, honestly. Especially when you said we throw man under the bus now. I think that what we're talking about and what we're seeing and trying to diagnose is the kind of implicit logics in these worldviews. You can look at them from multiple different places, but these implicit logics, these implicit dynamics and principles are really more, or it's more the more appropriate term, I think, than logic. They're playing out everywhere, and so we can say, well, we should look at this culture or that culture or whatever. But I think what we're trying to find are these principles that we see playing out, right? And so I think what we see with the medieval worldview is, yes, there is the equivocation that Rick just talked about in terms of is, and what Stephen just said, is nature home or is it alien? Either way, though, it views nature as an artifact in relation to God. God made it. So it's there as an artifact. What I would argue is that then, regardless of the kind of whether we argue it's a sacred artifact or it's a use, either way, it's an artifact. The implicit principle at play there to me is that ends up being, whether we like it or not, a kind of negation of nature. It becomes something that we can use because it's just a thing that God made. Now, then that takes us into the modern worldview, which, Christianity is accidentally responsible for science in a way, basically, right? And we start seeing the world in this way that was actually implied in the previous way of seeing the world. We've just drawn it out further away from its original kind of context. So then I think what we are seeing, and I think probably what is being argued in times as well, is that we're now at that next phase of where the implications of looking at man as the end all be all are now playing out in their most horrifying implications, which is, as Stephen said, he gets thrown under the bus because he has extricated himself from anything larger than him, or than mankind, than humanity, right? If once humanity, the implications of making humanity the end all be all are that, well, then actually our nihilism, essentially, right? There is no meaning for us. There is no value for us because nothing is greater than us. Okay, then I can do fucking anything, right? But then again, when you play that out to its logical extreme, we get to where we are clearly, I think clearly but definitely headed towards just, to me, it seems like we're because even Nazism, all of the monstrosities of the 20th century, right, is you can just treat them. It's just, they're just, it's the scene in The Third Man where he's up in the Ferris wheel and he's like, look down at all of them. They're just a bunch of ants, right? And so then we can apotheosize ego, essentially, right? And then it becomes, well, whoever has the biggest ego wins, and that negates everybody else because I have nothing to answer to.
Thank you, Joshua. Yeah, this is the core problem, is that we discover that nature can be used as a principle and source of meaning when we study the ancient world and how it's organized, because all around us, anybody who spends any time in nature can see the astonishing degree of intricate coordination that's happening. There's the amount of harmonization is staggering. And it's not that nobody eats anybody else and nothing bad ever happens, but that the species as a whole, they really orient towards a health promoting direction. And that idea of phronesis and sophrosune that the ancients had words for and we don't. What is the proper direction for the species to grow, to realize its arete, to live a bountiful, healthy, vibrant life that creates a greater whole within nature, the way that wholes form greater wholes naturally within nature as a result of their behavior, not in a clean, tidy, perfect way, but in a messy, responding to the vicissitudes of life, the struggle between agency and contingency, nevertheless, over billions of years, moves in the direction of a kind of harmonization. So that allows nature to be a principle of meaning and coordination for us. And especially the ancient gods who are reflecting aspects of nature, they still have that capacity to do likewise. They're sort of, if anything, Cliff's notes to nature. You know, they're a stripped down version trying to identify the most essential, authoritative parts of nature that Homo sapiens would do well to watch and be, careful to attend to. But man can't act as such a. I'm rephrasing what you said, but man can't act as such a principle, because a cheetah will never want to wake up one day and say, what would be great is if I killed all the other cheetahs and then I'd win. They can't, the instincts won't let them think that. They've evolved too far to have an interest or even an awareness of the possibility of exterminating all the other cheetahs and I can be number one. It's outside the range of behavior, that the character, the ethos of a cheetah has no room for that. That's not among its principles. The daimon of a cheetah, is oriented in directions that are overall health promoting. But Homo sapiens, our stupid pet trick in evolution was to strip away a whole bunch of that and leave ourselves with a greater capacity to imagine and act at the cost of the ability to get attached to the idea of what if I killed all the other people and I could be the winner. People think that easily. I mean, every adolescent at some frustrated moment thinks, if only I could get rid of all these people who are frustrating me. It comes so naturally to us. It's the consequence of our evolution that the phronesis that comes so easily to a cheetah is very hard for a human being to ever get their hands on, clearly. When we do, we don't know that we have it. The next month, we might turn away from it again. It's a really hard thing for our species in particular. And as a result, it means that if you latch on to Homo sapiens as a source of meaning, you're going to be all over the place. One guy is all about, collecting old RCA records, and that's the source of his meaning. And if he's your example, now we all have to collect RCA records. And what does that have to do with phronesis? There's no coherency here. This, as you said, you mentioned Nazism, right? You might get some obsession about, what if I could only purify the blood in my country, we could all be of one race, then surely Germany shall thrive. And next thing you know, everybody's latched onto it and they're all trying to do the same thing, even though there's no phronesis there, there's no sophrosune, there's no health for the species there. And yet we attach to that just as easily as we do to, I should eat healthy food, maybe easier. So that whole idea of, man as a source of meaning that modernity embraces, it has as its critical flaw the failure to understand why, in the ancient worldview, we had to have nature and the gods above us, which is that we're the problem that nature and gods as sources of meaning are trying to solve. And if we remove them from the picture, we lose the benefits of those additional sources of meaning, and we're left entirely with the problem magnified to its greatest possible extent, because now we're not allowing for any other source of meaning. And this is what Nietzsche meant, among other things, when he said, man is not a source of meaning. He's a problem that has to be overcome. We're the problem that has to be fixed, that we don't know where phronesis lies. So modernity is sort of based on this kind of crazed idea that I think, I think of this similarly to the way I think about the opening of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, it's self-evident that we're free. And we're not free because we struggled for it. We were just born that way. God gave it to us. It was under the Christmas tree on our 0th birthday when we were born. We don't have to struggle to become free. We don't have to struggle to develop ourselves as characters who are competent to rein in our appetites and ideology sufficiently, to act with meaningful freedom. No, we're free for free. No effort required. And that's the same kind of nonsense that you see when we remove God and nature from the equation of sources of meaning and just say, man could be his own source of meaning for free. We just will automatically have phronesis and sophrosune. automatically is our birthright. If we get together in a crowd, we will naturally know what the right thing is to do. And this is exactly the opposite of the ancient worldview, which is, are you insane? That's the problem that we have to solve. You can't beg the question like that by saying the problem solves itself, or else, well, you get the 20th century, right? Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, this has become a very rich discussion. My thought is, like several people have mentioned that not only we have thrown nature overboard, God overboard, I think, I mean, not overboard, under the bus. I think mankind is about to be thrown under the bus. My thought is this way, mankind invented tools. I have nothing against tools as such, okay? But the thing is, the tool that gives us production and a better life and a better way of doing things is also the tool that kills us, in this sense. I was thinking, like when the Greeks, particularly around the time of Plato and Aristotle, I mean, you begin to learn about the forms of the mental construct, the ideas, the forms. And this concept, in a sense, is a strategy of understanding that gives us a way to kind of see the picture of the whole of experience in a more efficient way. And as the tools develop, I begin to understand it. And that's the displacement of the philosophy of mind over the philosophy of experience, okay? The poetics of experience. And my thought is that, as we develop these tools, what is happening now in the current state is that it encroaches on our lives more and more. And now we invented things, well, actually, not even now, but certainly with the telescope and the microscope and all sorts of instruments. These are instruments that are talking about expanding our sensibilities, our vision to see far and to see deep down. And so I call that a kind of super sensibility, and that super sensibility has a very profound relationship with concepts. Because now with computer technology, we know that many people understand that's happening in society too, that in a sense, we used to think of strategical thinking is broader conceptual thinking in relationship to the whole. But that is a shorthand of mind, in a sense, imposing it on what is actually happening in the ground, what's happening in nature. What supersensibility allows us to do is understand that advanced tactical relationship to what's underground surpasses strategy. It's actually more efficient in terms of understanding what's happening rather than a general idea of concept of mental construct. And we know that supersensibility of, let's say, computer science now, maybe not at the moment, but is able to create so many analytical devices of what's happening on the ground in so fast that it is surpassing conceptualization, which means that the philosophy of mind is about to go away with the idea of supersensibility. And I think that when you think about what I do not like about it, and I because I'm a humanist, what this supersensibility is, in a sense, infringing and negating on the primordial experience of human beings in relationship to his sensibilities in the world. And we will be displaced, if we're not careful, by beings that actually acts in relationship, not to conceptual ideas, but to supersensible ideas and what's actually happened, and respond quickly in relationship to what's happening. And it will take us a long time to conceptualize what's going on. And I think that is instrument that will throw us under the bus, because we will become, as best we can, become androids ourselves to actually have a chance to exist in that world of super sensible. And we know that it was what, maybe 15 years ago that, the computers, Big Blue, beat the world champion. And I just maybe 5 years ago or 4 years ago, I saw uh, AlphaGo. And it was a very, very interesting match, because the guy who's the world champion was a very, very good Go player. And they were playing 5 games, okay, to see who win. I guess 3 out of 5 will win. It's a winner. The computer won the first 3 games. It's already won, in a sense, right? What happened was the world champion won the 4th game, because there was an ability for human beings still that had intuitions and creativity that could jump over computation. And AlphaGo in the 5th game was a very interesting game that I saw. I thought that was the most important game. Somehow AlphaGo had understood that in some way, that it got to prevent this guy from having this intuitive genius. So it played the game. It was a very even game. The computer was winning by just a little bit. But he kept moving in a way that the Go champion had to respond. If he did not respond, that he would lose. And he kept playing, and the two kept playing, and at the end, the computer won by 2 points, because he knew to preoccupy the guy in terms of fighting the battle he was going to fight. And so therefore, the conceptualization, even intuition and creative intuition, couldn't overcome super sensibility and computation. And we are going to be thrown under the bus if we're not careful. An AI is coming to the point, when we actually get to the point of quantum computing, actual quantum computing, you will have no chance in outsmarting the computer. That's it. I just want to warn you, what we got to be concerned with is not progress beyond that, is that we have the concern that at the very bottom of it, we want to be and we want to exist. And we do not want to be slaves to computers. And we are becoming slaves already. Many people go on the internet and they just get so confused, because they thought, they would run into good friends, but in fact, they're being exploited. Okay, that's all I want to say. So just be very careful that all 3, nature, man, and God, has been thrown under the bus. Man is finally at this last leg of being thrown under. So thanks for getting on my point of trying to express that. It's not mine. It's actually just sensing the world in such a extraordinary way that we can't sense it and put it all together and respond quickly. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Joshua, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I guess I think what all of us are kind of getting at, it to me raises the issue of why looking at these issues in terms of their principal dynamics is so important. Looking at in being able to make the distinctions between essentialization and generalization. Those are not the same things, and we need to be able to think essentially. And so that's where, to me, also these issues of this culture or that culture or whatever, it doesn't exactly matter, because what Phil is describing is these issues of character that play out throughout all humans in variations, but that is the theme. And what what we are seeing in terms of the overwhelming takeover of, Emerson in the 1800s said machines are things are in the saddle and riding us, right? The issue is, though, it's not. We can read that multiple ways. It's not that this is some sort of accident, that's just happening to us. It's that a type of a world view that is an intrinsic character trait of all humans, within all humans, but has taken over. That is the left brain, the mechanical, the banalsic, as the Greeks and Kenneth have typified it. These are all interrelated, essential principles that we're discussing, right? We all have that mind in us, but that is the mind that through classical Greek, which was more right-brained, more whole-brained, really, towards Christianity and science, we see this divorcing of the hemispheres, the divorcing of these characterologies, and that banalsic, mechanistic way of seeing the world has unequivocally, undeniably, once you understand those terms, taken over, completely has taken over. And so everything that we talk about, everything that we're discussing, all is being shoved through the lens of that worldview of that everything is just some kind of machine that we can manipulate, and it's not a question of whether that's true or not. It's a question of whether we're manipulating it in the right way or not. So all of our discussions about our technological problems, we always have the solution to those problems are always another technology. But again, the issue there is but that's the same worldview that we're talking about. It's the mechanical way of seeing the world. So where Phil was just talking about this, no, I know what he made me think of is like the idea of the android. I think it's another way, like we see in science fiction over the last 100 years, these things are being described. I've listened to Philip K. Dick in interviews talk about his concept of the android. Our mechanical modernistic worldview looks at it as like, this is some sort of artifact that we've made. But I've heard him talk about it. I know he is understanding the concept of android as a metaphor. He is talking about character. He's not talking about robots. He's talking about people who see the world this way. And the issue then becomes that once those types have taken over, they have obscured this as an even issue at all for the rest of us. Then and once once they have dominated the symbols, we only see through their worldview, so we don't see a way out of it. And this is the value of this group that y'all have formed, right? Is triangulating these issues from different perspectives to start to understand what is actually occurring here. It's happened. So our issue is now, well, what do? I would argue we have to make ourselves more human. Is that going to stop the AI revolution? No, it's not. Are we on the verge of eradicating ourselves? Yes, we are. Is that a foregone conclusion? I don't think it is. I would say probably similar to what we saw in the 20th century. There's going to be mass genocides. We're clearly going to have climate disaster. We are in the midst of climate disaster right now. But what do we do? What the phronesis that Rick is talking about, right? What is the applicability of the wisdom that we are finding? Well, I would argue we form communities like this where we're discussing these issues. We make ourselves more human for future humans. And we're going to end up living alongside the androids as well, you know, that they're here. They've taken over, you know.
Thank you, Joshua. That's a compelling point about do androids dream of electric sheep? You know, what is what is what is he talking about there? Is he talking about actual robots, or is he talking about a mindset of character? And it's hard for us to conceive of character as moderns. It's hard for us to conceive of character as being real, as being a thing. I mean, it was during my lifetime that we were still teaching that people are born as a tabula rasa. They have no character at all.
This
And
mutes my audio.
ah,
Ah,
Kenneth,
yeah, you're on.
I believe I have broken through.
you have broken through, Kenneth. Yay, welcome.
Yes, I've been working at it. Angela's been working at it for an hour and a quarter now.
Well, victory. Victory
We
to
had to load it
Angela.
on the computer and do it that way.
Oh no.
Oh yes. Oh yes. Very
Yeah, what can I offer here? Any questions people want to lodge first, or I should try to pick a few notes to see if we can get Alexander's ragtime band kicking and live. Okay, this is it's been going in very many directions, and they all, you know, bear, I think, some deeper and you know, whatever more. It's Let me try to explain what I try to do when I philosophize or diagnose or anatomize, etc. I was suspicious long before I really understood what I was dealing with or the kinds of resources that I needed to develop. I was suspicious of simplisms. And one of the first experiences that really I would count as enlightening was a short story by Theodore Sturgeon, who was in his time after science fiction had tried to explore every fantasy on the development of future technologies. Science fiction finally turned self-reflective and began to ask, what does any or all of this imply about our understanding of what it is to be human? And Sturgeon is still a past master of this. I mean, the people who were the divided or scattered students of Theodore Sturgeon, they know one another. They recognize one another when they meet one another at science fiction conventions, so on and so on. He was a mind-blowing, idiosyncratic genius of the first magnitude. I call him the Dostoevsky of American science fiction. And in one of his stories, which I think was called The Clinic, the story is about a fellow who's been so troubled or so much trouble for other people. He has been put in this clinic, and the doctor is trying to talk with him about what his problem is. And he understands his problem very well. His problem is that everybody else is thinking one note at a time, like a ukulele or what have you. And he keeps trying to think in chords. I've got, you know, and I thought, not only is that pretty close to what I like and tend to do, but thinking in compounds, understanding that a concept is not the be all end all or an idea. It's not, you know, truth that you're getting at by means of these things. They're just the purifications of a certain color or sound or something. And, you know, if you want to relate to realities, including the human reality, you have to learn how to synthesize, how to syncretize, how to orchestrate the different components that are there. No one ever really asks a simple question. Questions are laced over with layer upon layer. If you don't know how to psychoanalyze someone, You don't know how to deal with their questions. They're asking questions, even when they mean to be extremely intellectual. They're asking questions from the standpoint of, I mean, they are like Grand Central Station. We all are. And when we try to use our minds, a bunch of trains are coming in at the same time and crowds of people and so on and so on. Well, you have to think, if you're a station master or whatever, you have to think in terms of the whole event. Everything that's going on there is pertinent. You have to offer, ingress and egress to these many different flowing directions of current, which are human beings. And the minds are no different. Getting a crowd of students, I almost said the word cloud, which would also be kind of, that may be the appropriate group noun for students, a cloud of students. When you're trying to deal with students in their unfocused, unrelated, I mean, they come into a class in the form of babble. They are, what a cafeteria would be like if nobody was coordinating anything. Human beings are the quintessence of chaos. And I want to say, too often they think they've resolved this because they have cut off their relatedness to the many dimensions that fall outside the zone of their focus and their language and their proclivities. We all tend to direct ourselves to what we expect. Heraclitus recognized this, 600 years before Jesus. There is a problem with our self-conduct as thinkers, and that is that we impose inevitably irrational regimens on ourselves. But if we want to liberate ourselves, we have to learn that thinking is the master act of juggling. It is carrying on relations, communications, perceptions, and so on. There's a magnificent Valéry, the French poet, essayist, etc., has a magnificent paragraph in which he says, in effect, that consciousness is like looking simultaneously at the surface of water, which reflects the sky overhead, but at the same time you're looking through it. It's many different kinds of processes, procedures, penetrations. Well, thinking has to be at least that. By simplifying things, we are doing ourselves no service. We are stupefying ourselves. Simplicity is the enemy of clarity in thinking. Clarity can be achieved in an easy, facile way, but it's dangerous. It's a drug. It's an opiate. Thinking is becoming the master of complexities in their complexity. It transfigures what we are and what we're trying to do and what we think we're trying to do. We're learning how to relate existentially, and that includes a factor of essentializing, which is a kind of simplifying, but it's an act of every real essentializing is an act of genius. Not many people can really accomplish it. And this is one of the things when you read someone. Before I read Heraclitus, and I don't know when that was anymore. It might have been between my freshman and sophomore years. I think that's when in college at UT. I had already read Chuang Tzu, and it was a mind-blowing experience, not just because here is a master of paradox, a challenger who just lays it out in, in the translator captured what he could of this. Those paradoxes taught me how to, what can I call it? Schizophrenify. Okay, how to schizophrenify my thinking. How to think at one and the same time that the implications of one very ambivalent, ambiguous term, it splits off. It leads in two different directions. Well, we're that kind of a creature. We have a right hand and a left hand and a right brain and a left brain, an eye, another eye, ears. Somewhere in our normally functioning brain, we achieve three-dimensional vision by the synthesis of what our left eye grasps, what our right eye grasps. Why not expect that miracle of syncretism in everything we think we're trying to do? When someone asks a question, listen to what they say, but at the same time, even more importantly, is what they hint at. What were the raw materials out of which they formed that question? Where does that question tend that it didn't actually arrive at? And so on. Questions are schizoid things, and we capture a lot of this and let most of it go because we're there acting as censors. There is Whitehead makes a remarkable, brilliant observation when he says that every accomplishment in science is also accompanied by a great nescience, a cloud of unknowing that we are losing. This is the material we let go. But the truth is the whole, as Hegel says. The truth is we are outmeasured, we are outranked, we are beyond our comprehension, our capture. There is the complexity of the whole family of things that are going on in the original happening or experience or whatever. Something was going on beyond the simplicities that we thought we would grasp. We came away from it with a handful, but it was a herd full of phenomena. A great boon was given to me when my sixth grade teacher explained to me what was going on at the University of Texas at Austin, because what she introduced me to was the program in world cinema. I was fed up to here with Disney and Hollywood and all the other. It is so sheerly artificial. I mean, the geniuses, as far as I was concerned, of 20th century cinema were people like Fellini and John Cassavetes. These people were the Miles Davis of cinemasters. Miles discovered he could induce the audience to provide the notes that he didn't play. He could conscript the audience to become a member in the performance. And the same thing is true when people when they throw away the scripts, the way Fellini and Cassavetes did. Just tell your actors such and such is going to go on. You're going to do as you normally naturally would, react to this with your ordinary human authentic sensibilities. So we're seeing actors who have been converted into scriptwriters and even directors. This is a completely different, how are we to realize the phoniness of phony performances? unless we somehow get exposed or find an access to authentic performances that have the spontaneity, the extemporaneous vitality of someone inventing a perspective or a logic or a reaction all on their own. Okay, the best classes I ever taught were the earliest because I had no notes. I had no time to think and prepare before class. But the material was still hot in my mind from having worked in it for so long. So the students are getting, not a cold, dead, dry academic reading of already existing logics and so on. They're getting me on the verge of bursting into flame. And, there's no question, the students were really transported by this. And I figured out what I was doing and why it worked so well too late to think about recording it. I started recording it, but then of course you have the consciousness that, well, you're doing this in part for the benefit of this recording device. Plus you look at the recording device. It's a lot of trouble to locate the same passage or whatever again on a recorded tape. Anyhow, the value of experiencing and making yourself vulnerable to the openness that everyday life, if you're lucky, I mean, I have to admit, when I think about it, I find very few people have an existence or a mode of earning their living or relating to their friends or neighbors. Very few people have an authentic spontaneity of discovering themselves every moment, discovering the difference between how they saw something yesterday and today and how it may be next week. Where is this heading? It makes you reflective because it makes you rise up out of the this here now, and you start in that way to, on the one hand, you are more alienated. You're alienated from a normality, which is unfortunately also alienating. You're rising above habituations. You're rising above complexes and patterns of phraseology that you've picked up from other people. You kind of collected it the way some people collect seashells. It becomes a thing to, it becomes a thing that you can trip over, a thing that distracts you because you feel these little particles all around. To master these things requires developing a very special kind of talent, the talent that a director has, of a movie or an orchestra or whatever. If something is out of key, something's off timing, whatever, you're alive to all that. And beyond that, the performance as a whole is an organism, just like existence, just like being an individual, just an individual, who is seated in the socket of life, but not in such a way as to be bound in by it, but in such a way as to be multi-dimensionally master of it. Okay, when I think about what philosophy has done for me and challenged me to do, it was certainly to carry to a higher and higher level of, I want to call it connoisseurial. I want to call it, it's a kind of virtuosic exposure to living. If I believe what the students were telling me for all these years, I I was conveying, I was sharing a lot of that energy, a lot of that. The world is a manifold of wonders. It's not just a wonder. Beware of, saying the simple thing. Always look for the complications, the conditions that need to be attached to it, the secondary melodies, the undertones, the counter the counter developments. There is a invitation to irony in everything. People who have sufficiently, it's what Hegel calls dialectical. We have a kind of instinct. Once we get sufficiently cultured, we have a kind of instinct for hearing the things that are also said, the undertones, the countermanding, contrapositional reflections. We want to contradict what's said. Well, that's a healthy reaction. That should be part of any conversation, and part also of our reflections with ourselves. You learn to have serious exploratory arguments with your own self. Too many people, I gather, just agree with themselves. That's the sappy, sentimental thing to do. If your sensibility is that sensitive, you have a problem. If you can't even be a challenger to your own way of seeing things, phrasing things, etc., that is the way to not grow. That's the way to go through life as statically as you can arrange it. But that's also called being a zombie. That's the death in life. Habit it's the beginning of the end. Learning to shake it, learning to go back and rethink. You could write the most perfect account of what you believe or what you saw or what you think. The truth is, you could go back and reread it and totally surprise yourself in a week or whatever, and you would discover there are currents. There's another line of logic leading off to a totally different neighborhood in the midst of that. So, as I understand it, philosophy needs to be brought up to a par with the multifaceted. If we had the choice, wouldn't we all have made the selection of having the compound eye of a fly? Wouldn't we love to see? Because that's what we're struggling for. When you have a conversation with someone else, you're struggling to look at what they're saying from their point of view. Now, how is that possible? Who was it? Walt Whitman. I'm large enough to contain multitudes. And you read his poetry, you understand he damn well was. How many minds did it take to move him this way and that, across the planes of existence as he saw it in one moment and in another. Hegel, I think, reinforces a nugget of Heraclitus's wisdom when Heraclitus says all things flow. Hegel takes that for granted, that flux. Our thinking is a constant, fluid performance or experience. Things are changing within us, between us and the changing world and the other people that we relate to. It's remarkable that we can remain constant long enough to sustain a relation. It takes a lot. It's not the simpleton that does that. They're trapped in one stunted situation relating to another person who's in a stunted situation, but that's not life. Life is flux. In fact, this is such a profound principle in Hegel's philosophy. He argues that the the state of being trapped in an idée fixe and a compulsive, fixated idea, that is the quintessence of insanity. Well, what does that imply about sanity? Sanity is the multitudinous transformations, metamorphic existence. So, I've completely lost track of where I started out with this, which is possibly the point of it all. I was trying to explain. The Greeks were fascinated with the topic, the problem of the one and the many. We are the one and the many. We are constantly promulgating, proliferating. The powers that we have in us are all each pregnant. They're going somewhere. And that is as much as to say, that's the way we participate in what the Greeks understood nature to be, becoming, physis. Everything is on the way somewhere. Nothing can be fixed. Even things that are dead are decaying. They don't stay what they are. The power of philosophy, when it's properly, thoroughly, profoundly understood, there is no conflict between philosophy and life. Philosophy is a form of life. Life is something that we will only understand if we philosophize about it. Philosophy is a way of being more alive than the unphilosophical will ever be able to appreciate. And I'm trying to remember a great quote attributed to Aristotle. We are it'll recur to me. Everything sooner or later does. There must be a ton of questions out there. I'm wondering what I may do to either completely baffle you or oblige you to take your question back or whatever.
Okay, why don't we take some questions and then you can reply.
Yeah, please.
So, Phil, you've had your hand up. Why don't you come off mute and tell us what's on your mind?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the way you said that philosophy is part of life, and also that it's dynamic, it's
Yes.
ever-changing, it's a part of existence. What do you think of what we are now teaching in philosophy, which is essentially the history of philosophy? In other words, it's become history. Now, maybe you could argue history is living, but history seems to be like something that has already happened, is not currently now. And so it seems to be a retracing of the thing. It progresses, but these comments all extend back to what other people said, and so it became this sort of almost a constant quotation and transformation through quotations. Could you say something about that, which is what professional philosophy generally is? In other
Yes.
words,
Academic philosophy these are the morticians of philosophy. And in all the years that I was taking courses and presenting papers and having conferences with other people in academia, I could count on the fingers of one hand the actual philosophers. I mean, I could count I think John Silber was one. I think well, Paul Weiss, no question. There are people. They're deeper. They have a, I don't think they could say a simple, unqualified thing because it would insult your intelligence. That's not what they're not what they are there to do. They're there to stimulate, aggravate your intelligence, to get people to understand in such a way that you are at the same time impregnating them with questions is the thing. This is the shared life energy, which a philosophical discussion should be able to convey. It's a little compact epidemic. People are, it's they thought it was the middle of winter and it's really spring. It's time when nature starts budding. Something in them is turning a season. The power of, I want to say there is already a vital, an almost, I would call it insuperable. I don't think most people really see how bad or desperate this problem is, and therefore how difficult it is to overcome. And that difficulty is converting living speech into written word. When you see a book that has endured through the ages and it still has, it speaks to the people who are themselves properly, it's not just preparation. I want to say being who you are is a lot like the art of being a chef. You have to have the right proportions of things. You have to know the right time to join up these different components. We are temporal creatures, and attempting to think about ourselves from the standpoint of eternity is a little diluted. It's an effort. We should make it once in a while. From the standpoint of eternity, we might ask ourselves, what would I ultimately like to aim at with my life? Or how did I do aiming at this way back when? Did I arrive at something like the state of development that I hoped I would arrive at, etc.? The power of speech, because it is so animating, so immediate, it's full of speech is full of all the richness that has been reduced out of the dead written word. The written word is getting transmitted into our minds by one sense only. But there's more than just hearing and seeing involved in a living transaction. So, the quality of energies, the quality, again, this kind of, it comes back to that, the purge, the reduction of unattended to, neglected, ignored elements and factors. We have, when you listen to someone giving an actual speech, and it's not only, it's not cooked, it's not in any way prepared in advance. It's really from the heart. It's really as authentic an expression as was possible for a person speaking on such and such a topic. By look at Americans. We are such a people so stupefied. We believe politicians who are standing up and giving us pre-written. Somebody else wrote these words, and then somebody else edited and criticized that presentation. What are you getting? You got something by the time you're through that a committee produced. if they could manage, does it matter whether they are in a coherent state of mind, that they're all equally sane at the same point? We are so used. This is like the Hollywood version of what life is about. Not only has a team of writers and editors and producers and so on, you have countless layers of people who have cooked and recooked and trimmed and butchered something in order to make it as so that it will go down as simply, unobstructedly. Well, we need those obstructions. We need to think about, wait a minute, I don't agree with this. I have second thoughts about a certain topic or whatever. Even though I agreed with this yesterday, I realize I'm not just of two minds, I'm of three or four. I mean, you have to realize when you read someone like Hegel, there is a daunting challenge of whether he has really achieved the fluid, with all the books that he wrote, he's achieved the fluid presentation of a perfect systemic coherence. And along comes Nietzsche and says, the hell with all that. He every time he sits down with pen and paper, he's conducting a new thought experiment. He's taking on a premise, he's exploring where it leads, he's trying to relate it to other issues to a limited extent. Nietzsche is the anti-systematizer, but this is close to the spontaneous flow. I mean, Nietzsche is the Fellini of philosophy. I mean, Fellini reached a point where he couldn't get money to produce his movies unless he claimed to have scripts. So he lied. He said he had scripts, and he was trying to attract actors to come and try out for the roles and so forth. And so they would want to see the script, and he says, no, I have the script in a locked file cabinet in a drawer and so forth. And someone eventually jimmied that drawer when he wasn't around. There was an obscene cartoon that Fellini himself, was a great cartoonist, had drawn that had nothing to do with anything. There are never any scripts that he was working from. This is the super expensive perversion of a very costly orchestral concert. A lot of talent, a lot of technical expertise have to be focused. You can understand why the people who put up the money for movies expect to see something that can be approved of in advance. They don't want their money getting blown away on a whim. But Fellini proved that's the most fantastic. That is, or even more so, that's the most lifelike. It taps into layers of fear and hope and love and so forth, things that are not processed meat, processed cheese, the way moderns have gotten used to expecting. So I don't know whether in the middle of all of that I answered the question in any useful way, but
we'll call that an answer.
yeah, I'm if necessary, I am just an endless proponent of the value of learning to tap into the flow of your insights and inspiration. There are even more subtle things going on in your logical functions, but it's as if we had gone to a theological seminary and purged everything that we ought to be ashamed of. You know, we're not even, we're still haunted. We're still haunted by, you know, id and superego and libido and so forth. All these irrational elements, of course, they're there. They generate, they propagate. That's their whole function. They're like energy glands that keep going off over and over. And we have to try to civilize these things, and we have to try to make these things more aesthetic, more appealing to us, more appealing to other people. You know, it's not enough just to repress them, ignore them. Everything about a human being needs to be civilized. Philosophy is that. It is us digesting the raw material of what we are into something that is more alive than what we began with. It just this is not intelligible to people who haven't been through the process.
Right.
They think they already are
Right.
the essence and the totality of everything they can be. I mean, seeing life from the standpoint of that compound eye just makes a hell of a difference. You know, the greatest poets. I mean, I learned a great deal from reading Yeats, not just his poetry, but his essays. You know, he is one of these alive to everything thinkers. You know, it's not a. Some people find it possible to write just a sparse, Spartan little concentration of verse, and it's enough for them to be whatever recalling themselves. You know, whenever an appropriately musically toned piece of thinking and language occurs, they hop on that little train and they write it, and they have a poem. But people who are poets, I mean, Yeats wrote some lines that I heart, you know, man is in love and loves what vanishes. The circumstances in which we come to appreciate that are just lacerating. But to know that insight has been framed by someone so eloquent and found this perfectly simple way of expressing it. You know, life may seem to a lot of people like an affliction, but it carries its own cure. You know, that doesn't go on forever. But the mastery of life, you know, when I again, when I hearken on a lot of these issues to a kind of archetypal expression, I'm surprised how many times it comes out to be something Aristotle said. Life, now I've moved on so far beyond what I was saying before, I can't recall where I was going. Yes.
Yeah, we'll circle back.
More questions.
Yes. Question number 2 is from Joshua Ray. So come off mute, Joshua, and tell us what's on your mind.
We just
Ken, go ahead.
We just talked. Good to
Yeah.
hear. Good to see and hear you this time.
Were you privy to the conversation that was going on before your voice chat finally came in?
Yes, I may have missed some large swatches of it because we had problems with the connection, but yeah.
Okay, so I wanted to kind of like bring back. So I think something that was implicit in what we were talking about is, to me, something kind of philosophically applicable, which is the issues of I think the value. I guess I was wondering if you can speak to the value of kind of the practice of mythos, the practice of philosophos, as a kind of self-culturing in the face of a kind of overwhelmingly mechanized and mechanizing artificiality that we have as humans found ourselves creating.
Yeah, I just as the other issues related back to mythos and logos, I want to say the corresponding divinities for the Greeks have a great deal to do with this. I mean, on the one hand, there is the Dionysian. There are the outflowing energies, the chaos making, the flood of energies that need to, something needs to be done with them. You know, they won't keep. You can't contain them. People need to express themselves, if nothing else, certainly to themselves. On the other hand, there is the value of structure, order, lawfulness, rational discipline. The Aristotle I was thinking of earlier was Aristotle's, perhaps his finest concentration of what it is to be aristic, is that this is the accomplishment of the people who achieve the most difficult thing of all, and that is self-mastery. Most people who you may think from the outside have a form of self-mastery, in fact, are just self-stunted, they're self-imprisoned. They're afraid of their own energies. So they have learned to be docile, or in a different point of view, self-defeated. You have to, I mean, you know, if you were a dog, of which you were also the master, you would be a creature that, you know, on the one hand, respects the need of the little quadruped to get out and romp. The dog has got energies that have got no place in the house, and it's to that dog's credit that he learns to behave himself in a house, mostly, and keep it pent up until you take him somewhere where he can unleash it. Aristotle's insight is closely related to this Dionysian, Apollonian. These are remarkable, richly concentrated understandings of what religion is for. It's, you know, which is to say, ultimately, what culture is for. I have a hard time trying. I have had a hard time trying to get across to students that what we think of as religion, just as what we think of philosophy, these things are really radically, I mean profoundly, quite different from that. Religion comes from a family of terms in Latin, gero, gerere, which means to carry on, to wage war would be used, this term would be used for that. Religion is to respect those things that most ought to be respected. It's more or less the opposite. Religare is more or less the opposite of negligere, negligence, to ignore, not to pay proper care about. So the value of constraint, the value of spontaneity, These things belong together, and you could, in Hegelian terms, say there's a dialectic between these. The creative life, the philosophical life, the self-reflective, the cultural life. These are all really different forms of the dynamic duo formed by Dionysian energies, Apollonian energies. We are the kinds of god animals or animal gods or whatever. We are, on the one hand, we are richer in forms than we realize. On the other hand, we are richer in instincts and feelings. We have a surplus. We have an overplus. There's more in us than we know how to apply to finite projects. And you have to sympathize with creative people who have that kind of an overplus. If you have just a limited discharge of energy, you may not have much of a problem in writing. But if you have too many projects, these things just bedog you. It's like trying to dream too many dreams at once. These things have a life, an imperative of their own, and they don't appreciate being stifled. There's a great quote, which I'm dead certain comes from Jung, but for the life of me, I cannot locate it anywhere again. The unlived life avenges itself. That is to say, the energies, the inspirations, the impulses, every temptation we have presented to ourselves needed to have been fed or given a run around the park for its own delight. Being repressed, constrained, being creatures of a code of conduct. This is not civilization. It's not soul. It's not spirit. It's not philosophy. Bourgeois has, for the very longest time, it conveyed exactly this culture of repression. And this, Freud, of course, wrote entire books on civilization and its discontents, and how repression is the genius of civilization. And what this implies is there is a kind of death wish underlying civilized life. Well, we see what that death wish energy looks like too often. It's all too naked in certainly recent history. Nazism is this, the kinds of energies that fed fascism and so forth. People just could not come to terms any longer. I hearken back, I think, on this issue to those long, dreadful, dire centuries when the ancient world order was just dying on its feet. And what was growing in its stead was the mafioso culture of the Roman Empire. It was sucking the life out of people. It was killing their will to live. It was turning people into slaves. This was the meaning of when the Christian faith originated, and there was all this emphasis. Why were they inspired by the use of the concept of redemption? Redemption means buying somebody back, someone who has been made a slave. That's what that long period of the murder of the soul consisted in, when the Roman Empire was building up its titanic totalitarian power over things. I remind people there was I'm trying to think of the Greek word. Now I had it in mind just a little while ago. There was a well, oh yes, there's a term which in the New Testament is translated as sloth, and essentially that is a way of talking about spiritual apathy, demoralization, the dying away of, or just outright dying of our will to live, our hopes, our belief that we are somehow rooted in the future toward which we are drawing ourselves. That word sloth is in Greek Acadia. It's sometimes spelled Acedia, which means anesthesia, the killing off of life. It's the genius of an authoritarian culture that it finds ways to kill the enthusiasm of human beings. And we've done the same thing. It doesn't really have to do, in our case, quite of the dominance of the state, although that's not missing from our situation. But in our case, it's a condition called economism. Instead of being a society that has an economy, we have become an economy that hardly has any society left in it. We live for the sake of working. We hope to be able to retire, but there are problems. We're slaves to money, whether we retire or not. The money logic owns us. There is a type of character, the Banausic, according to Aristotle, that thrives in a condition, in a money world, an economy, economism, an economy universe. People can't see. What's the first thing we tell kids when they start out in school? Start thinking about what you may want to, specialize in and work in as a job for the rest of your life. They're already they're like mules getting shackled, getting harnessed for a lifetime of pulling drays and so on. Grasping the inner dynamics of their personality, finding out who they are, what they need, what they absolutely imperatively demand. This should be at the top of their list. They should be looking for clues every time they see a movie, hear a story, hear a joke. I mean, you learn something about yourself, aspect after aspect. And this is a way you can't come to a person and just directly tell them who they essentially are. They require. I mean, the first problem is people have a cloak of resistance against being told anything that's really essential. They think about it, but they don't really understand it. And if you want to get something across to people, you have to learn how to do it obliquely. I know a fellow who's a comic book artist, and he kept encountering resistance from his son every time he tried saying, I know you like so-and-so, but you ought to really take a good look at this particular artist who used to be doing such and such in the field. And his son would, yeah, this is what Dad says. So what he finally figured out what to do is take an old comic, leave it open on the coffee table, and not refer to it at all. His son would eventually take a glance and say, no, why did Dad leave this? And he's fascinated with the style. Hello, what you need? Is it out?
Checking the battery.
Oh, okay.
Was that you, Pete?
Yes, that's my my angel of deliverance. um, the people have more ways of thwarting instruction and philosophical, deeper insights, because these things challenge their whole framework. I mean, you're giving someone, when you tell them something essential, you're challenging their whole way of evaluating, prioritizing, etc. What they spent most of their energies trying to construct as a little habitation for their psyche. What they need is a way of wandering into the possibilities of seeing things otherwise and thinking about things in terms of other vital principles and so on. The roundabout route is that's the charm. That is what disarms people. That is what infects them like a worm, and it just burrows and makes a little pleasant nest for itself. The value of myth, the value of allegories and fables and so forth. All of these things are ways of creating a diversion. You think about something as if it were just about what it claims or purports to be about, but really it's about far more than that. And that's the challenge, the implication. But all of this has to be carried through in an oblique way. I mean, I come back to the wisdom of Heraclitus. He rarely makes an overt thesis. He says, that philosophical truth is like the kind of thing that the Oracle of Apollo, it tells things that are riddles. It gives you the truth in a form that defies you to locate your mentality and your conscience and so forth in just the right relationship. You think you know how to play the instrument, which is you, but even the position that you occupy toward yourself is as relevant as how you play it. You have to you have to strategize. You have to assume the most artful position to the art, and so on. I've probably left more loose ends the longer I go on. So I'm never surprised when people says, "Whatever happened to that thesis that you started picking on a long time ago?" It happens in most of my classes, my best classes. So
it's a great answer, Kenneth. Thank you.
Well, my pleasure.
You ready for our third question?
Yeah, it better be a booger.
All right, it will be. It's coming from down under. Our third question is from Stephen Higson. Come on.
Oh, yes. Sure enough.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, looking at my own life, I tended to be a withdrawn person, and I preferred it that way. I looked at the world, and I'm thinking of Kierkegaard here. Kierkegaard talked about the personas. He talked about the aesthetic individual, which is the vast majority of people. And he talked about the ethics of taking responsibility. And at a level above that, he's talked about really thinking for yourself. But I didn't want to take responsibility. I thought, look, it's a great world. We're on a magnificent ship like the Titanic. I can just find myself a little spot in the world and play with my belly button. I enjoy that. And that's the world of a child. A child has a certain inner passivity. They're building up, they're learning to experience their own capabilities from a certain point. They're building up that way. And it's nice. There's a certain inner passivity as well. And this inner passivity means that the ordinary sensory experiences of the world can work in such an intense way on the inner being. But that's the life of the child. It's necessary for the child. They can't develop any other way. And of course, it's so sweet. As you actually do become an adult, you want to continue with this. You want to continue with this inner passivity. And I was happy for a long time until I noticed the Titanic was sinking. And at that point, I started to look around. I thought, all these clever people, they're walking around like zombies. And I started to, come up to that question of, taking responsibility. And I mean, above that, thinking. Real thinking is painful. It hurts. It's certainly not initially pleasurable, but this is very much the position mankind is in, that they want to remain children. And this comes to Faust and Mephistopheles. Faust lived a sort of eternal childhood and then reached a point in his life where he became dissatisfied. But Mephistopheles came along and said, hey, Faust, don't worry about inwardly changing yourself. I'll just outwardly give you everything you want, as long as you give me a drop of your blood, which is obviously something Mephistopheles didn't have, but he wanted very much. So Faust is drawn into the grand mistake of not changing himself inwardly and continuing on the magical path of externals. And this is where society and, the whole commercial market is. It's telling everybody, hey, just keep on being children. You're having a great time being children. We'll give you lots of toys. Just remain as you are, because you don't need to get into the responsibility. You don't need to get into thinking, because we've got AI coming along. We've got robots. The machine will be the parent. The machine will be the responsible one. The machine will do the thinking for you. Now, I'm not actually a great believer in AI. I think it's a bit of a con job, which everybody's been sucked into. But do you see my position there? Thank you.
Yeah. I wanted to go back first to what you were saying about Kierkegaard, because I think you've taken the aesthetic is certainly one of the most interesting, one of the most florid psychological portraits in Kierkegaard's writing. But numerically, statistically, I would say, and I think Kierkegaard may assume this also, that there is a kind of naivete or childishness, or whatever you should want to call it. The people in their undeveloped state, pre-aesthetic, most of them, as you also surmise, do not have they don't have the acuity, they don't have the agility, they don't have the intellectual or cultural development to be aesthetic. Probably the majority of any society is these, what might be called immediate people who remain as they found themselves. And the task or opportunity of developing themselves into something more agile and subtle and sophisticated, the majority of the population really doesn't have the resources to make themselves into aesthetics. But it is an earmark of modern society that a far larger proportion of the population than ever before turned into aesthetics are turning into aesthetics with us. This is where all the con men come from. This is where all the people who think they're going to establish themselves in eternal fame as an actor or a rock musician or something. They want to pretend to be something. There's an artificial personality, which has become the end being aimed at as if it were life itself. So, the aesthetic, in a way, and we see this phenomenon, of course, cropping up before Kierkegaard. He's just crystallizing where European culture, and if he knew more about it, American culture, where these things have been we are comparatively mass producing the aesthetic type. And the aesthetic is so called because they've turned living into really an art of living. It's how you live. It's what you pretend to be. It's the fiction that you project of yourself that other people know about you. And therefore, it's through all these figmentations that you learn how to dominate those people. So, nonetheless, even in our highly aestheticized society, the mass of the population is still passive. They're not even, I guess I'd say they're not even puerile, they're infantile. And what this implies is our great advances in technology have been a way of artificially returning to the womb. People are looking for a way not to have tasks, not to have relations. They can't stand it, but still they can't bring themselves to engage in the pains, etc., troubles of communicating. So there are, if you looked at a population, and this is totally speculative, if you looked at a population such as that of the United States, you might find that whatever 60 or 70% of it was people we would call just consumers. And what makes them happy is being exiting from the world and just living a private life. And they want media, they want music that they like, etc. They want, and whenever a politician tells them what they childishly or in an infantile way want to hear, he owns them. They're not normally active. They don't normally want to get involved in politics and economics and so on. But he will find, we have an obvious case of this. I don't even have to name the individuals who were involved. The people who are engaged this way, get turned into a flood type or a tide of thoughtless human actions. They are willing to be used. They're willing to subscribe to some movement that's in motion. They need a sense of empowerment, but they are still infantile. To become an aesthetic would require a level of sophistication, of artfulness. You have to learn how to control other people via rhetoric and the performances of who you're pretending to be. So, perhaps a tiny portion is aesthetic in this sense. I don't even know, perhaps 15 or 20%. Now, the interesting question is, well, then what about the ethical? Kierkegaard has some rigorous, Kierkegaard thinks that the ethical and the religious are really so intimately entangled that people have to have discovered themselves in the religious significance of being human, being who they are. But it's questionable whether that really amounts to ethics in the strict sense. And in a Kantian sense, there would be hardly any. Kantianism would require of people that they should have a rigorous sense of universality. What are the laws? What are the rules? What are the concepts of obligation, etc., that people have to be subject to before they qualify as ethical in Kant's sense? Now, we have other terms, for example, moral. And it's sad to say that Kant, in his own terminology, confuses these two, and many translators. I mean, morality traditionally, this comes from the Latin mos, mores, the plural of it. And there's a famous quote, I think it's from Cicero, O tempora, O mores, which is his way of saying, oh, the times, oh, the moral conventions or customs. And it's taken for granted when he says that morality is just waves of popular belief and feeling that happen to fluctuate. They're like customs. They're like what's hot on the market for a given time. Well, that certainly isn't going to qualify as Kantian. that's not ethical in Kant's rigorous sense. He's looking to, he's trying to get people to take a look, so to speak, from the standpoint of eternally valid standards of universality. So, it's an interesting. I'm particularly fascinated with attempts to diagnose the types of personality and social schemes, people's notion of where they belong, what do they need, how should they live, and so forth. A lot of research has been done from the standpoint of advertising culture. It used to be the case that there were general magazines back in the days of the Saturday Evening Post and Collier's and the things that are a couple of generations, behind us by now. People would pay money to advertise, and this was like a shotgun way of advertising because you're going to be read and your advertisement is going to be looked at by people of all sorts. But therefore, you have to pay the bulk rates, the very costly rates of a mass distributed magazine. So since that time, publications have shrunk down to specialized forms of magazines, specialized interest with specialized appeal to tiny fragments of that mass market. So it's become more and more important for advertising to understand what are the dominant, relevant species of personalities that somebody who has a particular kind of product to push, they will want this only to advertise to target, and they don't want to pay, of course, for all that, the rest of that population. So these are very interesting because some of what Aristotle argued, back about 500 years before Jesus, some of these things are still applicable. We have people who clearly would qualify as douloi. They're appetite driven. They hunger. They want things. And they are passively, pathetically dependent on other people to tell them what their appetites demand and what would be gratifying. And how many of the population would meet that? Who knows? The same thing is true with Manausoi, people who are money driven, people who are looking for power, they're looking for control, they're looking for status that would give them, privileged positions compared with other people. And, for various reasons, one of which is, I guess you would have to list Christianity with its concept that all human beings are made by God, and so we're, in a sense, made alike, in the sense that we are implicitly, in our potentiality, we are already marked as who we ought to be, what kind of a person we ought to develop into. So, I mean, in that sense, Christianity, the legal system, which imposes standards of universal obligation and so forth on people, rationality, and it has to make special cases out of people who are not competent to meet those standards, and so on. By and large, what Kierkegaard would say, the dominant strain of aestheticism, this merges in certain ways, certain respects, with that Aristotelian. I mean, you could say Marx is not far from Aristotle, because the bourgeois, the capitalist class, would certainly be the corresponding to Aristotle's Bonausoi. So that is it's an interesting issue. Everybody speaks his own language when it comes to analyzing human types, and very few people trouble to hash out the conflicts between their way and other people's way of analyzing. What is it that prevails? What gives a society its dominant tone, and so on. Well, there was something else that you brought up. I can't remember. That the issue of passivity, which to me correlates a lot with the so-called, this Freudian return to the womb thing. I mean, home theaters, alcoholism, of course, narcotics. All of these things are ways of escaping from the world. The world is getting uglier and uglier, more conflictive, and people are less and less competent. The educational system is certainly not giving people conceptual or moral resources with which to confront these things. So they suffer. They're looking for escape. That's the simplest, most naive approach to it. So, more questions?
Thanks, Kenneth. We've got 23 minutes left.
Heavens.
Third, yeah.
Yeah, I know where some of the time went.
Right. But we've always got next week. So before he left, Ari passed along the third question in the queue, and I promised to pass it along to you. So his question is, how do you feel about the idea that philosophy is the living aspect of information processing?
Well, information is a subcategory of knowledge. That is to say, it is conscious determinants. In other words, in information, the human mind is dealing with its own products. These are conceptualizations. They are specialized, critically determined or edited forms of categories, language, etc. So, you have a many times over reductionism taking place. And this enables the more controlled methodological processing of things taken as information. Information is a concept that was just begging for the invention of cybernetics. From way back when, it was still a human problem. The existence of too many details, too many data, and so forth. To process this stuff, you have to have a really facile, efficient methodology. And, from a different standpoint, this is what is called glibness. Okay, yes, it increases efficiency. You can't argue with that. But does it understand It's like saying, yeah, there are circumstances where you need to know the physiognomy of a certain country in detail that you need to travel through. Yeah, that's very pertinent. Maybe you could do it in a bus. Maybe you're going to have a tank, whatever, maybe an airplane. How you deal with the particularity of some landscape and how you confront the profile of information, of data. These have to do with the specific uses. They are really utilitarian considerations. Anytime we talk about efficiency, we're in the lap of Banauseia. So, okay, now the question that you asked, how does this relate to philosophy? It is not totally irrelevant to need to know what the dominant sector or profile of particular types or particular landscape or particular, whatever it is. If you might have cultures in which people produce books, every one of which is totally extraneous with respect to every other. You can't synthesize the books. You can't merge them in the same intelligence. So people would become more cultish, more drawn, more inwardly focused. In a way, books that can't be correlated with other books are just promoting babble. And this is a way of increasing the amount of knowledge or understanding, but not in such a way that it really catches fire as understanding. We need ways of comprehending these things, and that requires seeing the significance of them. And that requires having, a dialectic of synthesis. You have to be able to argue things out. And when people are really talking about the same thing from different perspectives, or when it's not the same thing at all, that is something that challenges the whole way that people approach the books, the coursework, the teaching, et cetera, et cetera. A culture that is content just to cater to the very limited, ingrown, I would call it idiotisms. Really, people grow up, but they still live in their own private little worlds. And information runs the risk of catering to that. And philosophy is a countermanding it's a counterforce against it. It's what do we really mean when we use such and such a term? What is personality? Does everyone equally have personality? Are there differences in magnitude and so forth? Aristotle makes great use of the term megalosoukia, which is great souledness. There's some people who live life with a phenomenal charge of psychic energy, and they are, that drive for self-mastery is just something astounding to behold. And if they can manage to put it into a book, it'll blow the minds of generations to come. But it's also the case there's also a kind of microsoukia, the micro souled. There are people who are very tentative, very focused, very picayune. I guess so many of them get into teaching English. They've given the discipline a bad name. But yeah, we because to me the issue of information and by implication a lot of the context of AI, by our concern about information is really ultimately within the matrix of the panacea of the culture. It's because people are looking to manipulate. They're looking, they're looking to control. They're looking to make, things that were previously, we just took them as they come, that fashions come and go in all areas. But now we want to make this predictable. And unfortunately, our politics shows this pretty nakedly. People are grabbing hold of the levers of power who want to turn, as it stands, the modern polity is not controllable enough. They want to iron out the resistance, and what will make, the kinds of actions and reactions that will make the douloi play, according to your script. And that has been perfected in country after country on more naive stock. And we're not very far from having it carried out as another gross experiment in America. So it goes.
Thanks, Kenneth.
Yeah.
We have 15 minutes left, and I'm going to reverse the order in the line because I think Phil got the first question, and he's in line again. So I think I want to put Zelig next because he hasn't spoken yet today. Zelig, what's your question? Come off mute and tell us.
Zelig, yes.
Yeah, how's it going, Kenneth Smith? I'm reading through your work, being in these conversations, I get a lot of resonance of Philip Reef and the psychological man.
I have a lot of respect for Reef.
Right. You mentioned the types of man fascinate you. And I've been an avid reader of Philip Reef. I've looked up everything, read almost everything that he published, and even did some archival research into Philip Reef. And his thesis seems to be that we're living in an era where Freud kind of sparked that movement of we are no longer going to have any leaders, but we're going to be taught by psychoanalysis to weed out any issues that we have without any leadership, and we're going to build our own character through psychoanalysis. But it didn't psychoanalysis failed at that, right? And we're living now in an era where we're left with that suspicion of any leadership is either up to something, either trying to trick us into some kind of power trip or some kind of scam, if you want to call it like that. And it was due to Max Weber, according to Philip Reef. It was Max Weber, Marx, and Freud, which you can sum her up with Marcuse, and Nietzsche, right? What do you think? What do you think of Philip Reef's thesis? Do you think it's still playing out, or are we in the age of another man?
Well, Reef is no simple. You can't really stick a pin in him like an instec on a display board. I once, when I was teaching at a small university in Dallas, I was present for a paper that Alistair McIntyre presented. He was well known for a book on after virtue, which is his approach to, what is the future of ethics going to be like, considering that we no longer have any of the senses of what used to be considered virtue. It's certainly not the concept that the Aristeia of the ancients had. And the more McIntyre talked, the more I was starting to recognize themes of Philip Reef cropping up. And after the talk, I went up and talked privately to McIntyre, and it turns out he was quite a close friend of McIntyre's, even though he didn't give him credit in the talk that he gave. And he reflected on some aspects that I wondered why his writings and Reef's writings kind of went off in very strange directions at the end of his career. He was reaching out to try and explain some more and more of the irrationalisms, I think, that beset the modern order. And what MacIntyre told me was that Reef was growing more and more afraid that he might be stoking forms of fascism with his concepts and arguments and criticisms and so forth. His criticisms of modern order overlapped in ways he hadn't anticipated with the reactions of fascism. And I thought about that, that fear would certainly explain why Reef seemed very uncertain what the path of his later books should take. If you read Reef, and you're familiar with, a lot of developments in British as well as American culture, you can see that there's something of the peculiar mix, but the peculiar mix that they share. But there is also an undercurrent of people whose grip on not just culture but their own selves, it has a what should you call it? They're like a demolition. They're like a fist. They have the intelligence of a fist. They believe in leveling the old order because they don't know any other way to deal with it. They want to reduce it to a shambles, and they think out of this, kind of miraculously, they're going to reconstruct the ideal, the utopian order that they dream of, but they don't recognize that they themselves don't share a common, coherent vision of what the future perfect society should be like. Really, this is a foreboding of the kind of infighting that revolutionary coups eventually lead to. Power comes into the hands of people who have never been in the matrix of a coherent, a culture that has the values enabling it to make people coherent with one another or with themselves. A disruptive, an anti-culture that infuses people with a mania to divorce themselves from all relations, and each one become an idiot, a savage, whatever, that just thinks for himself, and he doesn't have, he hypothesizes an irreality of being free from criticism. But that's not the way to acquire intelligence or rationality, certainly not wisdom. Contrariety, which is there. I mean, this is Heraclitus. War is the father of all things, polemos. Polemical intelligence is ingrained in all of us, and in him most of all. And we have to have reasoned our way through, i.e. struggled our way through the potential conflicts. We have to see conflicts that are subtler than most people can even, glimpse the possibility of. So Reef is I would put his books, when the chief value I see in his writing is he was one of the first to latch onto some of the insanities of modern scientism. What passes for science is not a coherent, rational ethos. science is something that a lot of people got into just for the sake of careerism, for the sake of having authority over other people, but they don't have authority over one another. The people in science are quite frequently grossly incompetent to communicate with their own colleagues. And it's not around academia, it's not an unheard of thing that people who have offices right next to one another, go their entire careers without having a searching conversation. And I hate to tell you, one of my best students went into library science, and there was a scientific journal that was published with international distribution, and it had a curiosity. The publishers wanted to know how many people were reading the various articles that they were publishing, and they commissioned this investigation, and the results were so despondent to them that they never did it again, because they found out they were publishing articles that had a worldwide readership of two people. Science is just as much a babble as the humanities, probably. I had remarks on papers that I'd contributed. Editors couldn't believe that somebody was still turning out, this old guard, old style, encyclopedic. I don't really have a good name for what I do, but when I write something on Hegel, I might bring anybody in to the argument. It helps elucidate one's understanding of Hegel, to take into account, certain medieval thinkers, Cusanus or whatever, Nietzsche even. Philosophers can be made to have an argument with one another, communicate with one another, maybe even better after they're dead. But this doesn't happen in politics. There's this living, there are too many people for whom politics is just the struggle for power. It's rabid dogs having a go at one another in a pound. So I'm not sure that answered anything, but thank you for putting it all together.
It's very interesting, though.
Yeah.
Our last question for today is from Phil. So mute, Phil, and tell us what's on your mind.
Sure.
Yeah, it might be an aspect of ancient philosophy, but it seems to me there's a deep entanglement between literature and philosophy. And in fact, mythos and logos is that talks about the entanglement. And I wonder, with that entanglement, in some sense, when we go back to the Greeks, we always mention Apollo and Dionysus. But why is the middle term, Artemis, not mentioned more? Because Heraclitus left his manuscript
exactly
not in the temple of Dionysus or Apollo, but it
was Artemis. It was the temple of Artemis.
Right, in the temple of Artemis. Now I know Artemis was a sister to Apollo. So in fact, I think
twins.
Apollo has an affection for Eros. But in some sense, Artemis was a huntress, but she was also a musician. A muse to the arts. So that itself talks about like going out to the world and observing the world as it is, and also bringing it back and creating kind of culture, aesthetics. Yeah. And so why is there and I would when you mentioned about but how does that bring into the question of morality? I wonder whether that relationship doesn't have already embedded within it also a situation about morality. Because if you take a look at literature such as Shakespeare, or whatever, it seems like a lot of literature has something to do with morality, but the morality was about a culture, relationship to others in a culture. And Artemis's morality, if there was one, seems to be that she also has respect for nature as well in the hunt. So,
Yes.
so third, I wonder what have we lost that morality between culture and nature? I mean, it seems to me Artemis does have a respect for that. I'm not sure if Apollo has it, but
Yeah.
Artemis does. So, could you say something about that? Because it seems interesting about that entanglement.
Yeah, I not only obviously the state of our our project of ecocide, um, this is as clear evidence as it could be that there any moral obligation between humans and the matrix of nature is, we've totally been deadened in that. The people have concerns about it, but the concerns don't really add up to constrictions of how we abuse nature. They're just our reaction to the catastrophes that result. Now, I have pondered the business of Artemis, because it has to be a significant thing, that the one great collection of his writings on nature that Heraclitus is purported to have produced, he left in her temple. And I thought, the huntress god. And what I think I would derive from this is Artemis is a huntress in pursuit of a living target. There is a counterintelligence out there. There's a creature that has instincts of its own. It has a way of looking at life and so forth. There's a great passage in what is his name? The author who lived in El Paso and just died in the past few years. He wrote, I think it was The Crossing. He wrote a book that the first part of which is entirely about a hunter going after a wolf. But it's also written from the point of view of the wolf. And he doesn't short the intelligence, incredible instinctual, strategic genius of this animal. You're enveloped in the this animal knows the landscape. It knows how to mislead. It knows how to leave traces that go off in one direction and so on. Heraclitus, I think, had a kinship with the huntress god because he understood that in the pursuit of truth and wisdom, this is not the pursuit of something dead. They are not fixed. They are not intellectually definable. They are constantly mutating. What we're looking for, we who try to be philosophers or whatever, we're pursuing something that is living its own life over against us. And it's mutating, it's wising up in reaction to our accomplishments over on our side. This is a game, you could call it chess, but that's way too intellectual. This is really, it's a life, if it's taken seriously enough, it's a life or death struggle. And something in us dies if we don't rise to those challenges. We go on living, but whatever, the soul, the spirit, the wisdom in us has kind of gone desiccated. It's all mummified. There are terrible cases where women don't even realize they're pregnant and the baby died, the infant died, the fetus dies, and they go on carrying it. And they may not discover for decades, what has happened. And there's so many lives are like that. a lot of this comes down to, I think, what Hegel realized. We don't even have a simple, coherent, intuitively graspable notion of what is essential in us. If you use words like soul, spirit, which Hegel wound up calling his pursuits phenomenology of spirit, etc. He thought he could use spirit as a universal, where Kant used something like rationality. Hegel thought this was a comprehensive and completely concrete way of describing the essence of what we are. We are spirit. It is the world as we live in was all produced by us. If we don't like the way things are, hey, we're the architects. Does any of this stuff really still meet human needs? We seem to be complaining about this, but do we know any better? Have we thought through? I go back again and again to the audacity of Theodore Sturgeon, who was going to turn science fiction into human natureology. And let's talk about the things that are so quintessentially human about us. They're so deeply buried, we don't even notice them. We don't know how to name them. We couldn't begin to diagnose them if something was going wrong in them. It's a challenge, and every genius that I felt really got a good grasp on any of these topics. I keep an entire enormous bookcase, which I consider, my sanctum. This is where I put all the writers and musicians and so forth. Anybody I think I've really learned something cosmic from. Keep those things together. It's getting harder and harder to squeeze the books into it. But I did that in every circumstance, every house, every apartment I've ever lived in. I had a little honorarium place. I had a place where I knew whenever I needed an uplifting idea or a note or something, people used to use Bibles and so forth. You turn to a passage randomly. Don't even look what you're pointing at. I guess I could do that with a lot of those writings. There's something of genius in every little fragment of a sentence. But no, you have to know what you esteem, even though, as the moral of Heraclitus and Artemis it makes pretty sharp. You'll never get a good grasp on it. It's as intelligent as you are, and it thinks it ought to remain free. So,
Thank you, Kenneth.
hey, my pleasure.
Well, this brings us to the end of our time today, and it has been delightful, Kenneth, having you on the call with us.
Yeah, hey, I'm glad to have shaken my asthenia and most of my medicaments well enough to have probably more clarity than I know what to do with. Who knows how much this is due to corticosteroids, and therefore artificial clarity.
Woohoo!
yeah, woohoo indeed. Good philosophical thesis.
Well, we'll be here every Monday at this time. So if you feel like joining us again, you know where to find us.
I'll make a contact in advance so we can. We have a lot of upcoming. Angela has some surgical work that I've got to help out with and drive her to and from, so forth. So I don't know how predictable the weeks from here on are, but yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Great idea.
Thank you.
So much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you, Kenneth. It
Thank
was
you.
nice to hear from you.
Great. My pleasure.
All right, and I'll see the rest of you next week.
Thanks,
Bye.
Rick.